Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Network 19 monthly networking session. Today, we are going to talk about opening a group home in Ohio, better understanding the process to help you be prepared if that is something that is, in the plans for your agency or something that you're just interested in exploring. We are glad to have you here. We understand, what it takes to find room on your schedule and your calendar to fit in these types of meetings when you have so much important work to do. So we do appreciate your time. We meet the third Thursday of each month with agency providers from 10 to 11:30. And then if you don't mind helping us get the word out, we also meet with our independent providers from 11:30 to 12:30. And generally, we do the same topic or a very similar topic for each of those sessions. And today, I wanted to tackle this because as I'm perusing social media, as I'm out there, providing some technical assistance and guidance to folks through the social media platform, I see a lot of questions and a lot of conversation about opening a group home. And what I find is that oftentimes the answers and information that's being shared isn't accurate. So I thought this would be a great topic for us to work on today. Next slide. So we are recording, but if you are with us and are interested in doing so, we'd love to see your faces. So feel free to turn your camera on. If you feel more comfortable behind the scenes, that's absolutely fine as well. But it's nice to put faces and names together. Also, this is a really informal session. We welcome your input. We want to hear your experiences. It's so much more valuable when you all can share with each other. So if you've been through this process, if there's something that you're like, Anne, I don't understand what you're talking about, or I think you missed this, please don't ever hesitate to jump in. We want this to be interactive. Or if again you are more comfortable just sharing that or asking questions via chat, please feel free to use the chat box as well. And then we always get asked, yes, the presentation and handouts will be emailed to you within a few days. We have a great support person at 19 Services, Zoe, and Zoe is great at getting everything sent out within a few days, making sure that you have all the handouts, making sure that you have a copy of the presentation. And then we also post the presentation on our new YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and reference something that we talked about, or if you have a colleague or another provider that you support that you think would benefit from the conversation, these recordings can always be viewed on our YouTube channel. Next slide. Thank you. So we use a lot of terms in this field. Obviously, you guys are familiar with that. And I want to make sure that throughout our conversation today, we touch on at least these important residential terms because they are all part of, in one way or another, providing residential services, whether that's in a group home setting or some other type of residential setting. So today we're going to talk about the terminology licensed, group home, certified, congregate living site, shared living, ICF IID, licensed residential facility, independent living, and supported living. Are there any terms that I missed or things that you guys are coming here going, I heard somebody throw out this word, I don't know what it means. Are there any that I missed? Or again, if you can't think of any off the top of your head, if you think of one as we're going through this presentation, feel free to type it into chat and we'll make sure that we get you some definition so that you leave here with a good catalog of terminology related to residential services.
Hey, Anne,
Uh-huh.
with the terms licensed and licensed residential facility,
Mm-hmm.
would you care to expand on maybe what those differences are?
Those are all built into the presentation,
Oh,
Haida.
oh, gotcha,
So
gotcha.
I have
Sorry.
made sure that somewhere in the presentation, we touch on each one of these. So yes, but if I don't get to exactly what you want or what you think is important, please jump in or say, hey, give us a little bit more information on that. But I hope I've touched on all of these within the presentation. All right, if you want to go to the next one. All right, we're going to start with licensed and certified and kind of understanding the difference between those two. And so we will see these terms often used interchangeably, but it really is important that we are a system of semantics. So it really is important to understand that there is a difference between these two terms. So when we use the term licensed, we are talking about a building. The department will license a physical structure. But we will often hear providers say, well, I'm a licensed provider. I'm licensed to provide services. And what they really are meaning is certified. And so the best way that I've kind of helped people keep these straight in their mind is DODD licenses buildings and they certify people or providers. And so it's really important, especially when it's in the context of looking at opening a residential facility that you want to get licensed, hence a licensed residential facility. And we'll talk about when a setting has to be licensed or doesn't have to be. But when you are interested in working with the department to open a licensed residential facility, you need to be able to speak that lingo. You need to be able to convey to them that what you are wanting to do is have a building become licensed versus you yourself as a provider or a provider agency becoming certified. And that gets even more technical when you get into PSM because both of those processes in some form live within PSM. And so if there is not clarity in your mind as an applicant of what you are trying to do as far as getting something licensed or becoming certified yourself, it will cause some issues with making sure that you go down the right path through the PSM system. Um, Certification is what allows the provider to bill for services, and it's not specific to being in a licensed setting. A provider is certified to bill for services in whatever setting those services take place. Being licensed, a building being licensed, is specific to that setting. And so it only allows those services to be performed in that particular setting. And so, again, that is a deviation between those two terms. One is specifically settings based, being licensed in a specific setting. And the other one, being certified, is not location based, it's service based. And it allows you to bill for services wherever those services can be provided. All right, go ahead to the next one. Any questions about licensed versus unlicensed, or I'm sorry, certified versus licensed? Okay. So that's kind of a 30,000 foot definition. Doesn't necessarily apply specifically to residential. And so we wanted to make sure that we kind of cleared up that part because those two terms come into play very early in a provider's journey in becoming either certified or developing a licensed setting. So now we want to get into a conversation that really does apply to a licensed setting. And we have in Ohio settings that are licensed and we have settings that are unlicensed. And a lot of times when someone becomes certified or they open an agency, they'll reach out to DODD or the county board to have a conversation about opening a group home. And really, if we want to be technical, because again, this is a system of semantics. Group home is just a generic term. There is really nothing in rule anywhere that uses the terminology group home. We have licensed residential facilities, which are licensed settings in which a group of people live together. It can also be a single person living in a licensed residential facility, but those are less common. Typically, it is what we call a congregate living setting in which more than one person lives together. But there can also be unlicensed residential settings. And so we want to talk today about the difference between those two. And when you want to provide services in a group home or congregate living setting, when do you have to ensure that that setting has been licensed? And when is it okay to proceed with services in a residential setting or a congregate care setting that is unlicensed? Go ahead. So there are lots of different types of residential settings. A person with a disability may live in a private home. It could be a home owned by the person themselves. It could be a family home where they live with family members. It could be a home that the person rents from a private landlord. And in some cases, there is also no provider involved at all because the person, though they may be receiving county board services, has the skills necessary to live independently, or they may have enough unpaid natural supports that they currently don't need any paid supports. And that's often referred to as independent living. But in situations in which people don't live independently and they do need paid supports, those can occur in, as I said, a private home. In private homes, the provider typically provides less than 24-hour services, and they're typically drop in nature. Private homes are not required to be licensed, though there are some settings in which the person is renting from a private landlord and the setting is licensed. So it's not a requirement, but there is an option to license a private home. Some teams believe that by licensing a private home. So let's say it's a home that I'm renting off of a community landlord. This landlord owns 10 or 20 rentals in my community. And I saw an ad in the paper and I went in, I filled out an application with my parents and they helped me or a friend or whoever. And they said, yep, you've got enough money, you can pay the rent, you can live here. But I'm just a landlord. I have nothing to do with providing your services. I get that. I enter into a lease or a rental agreement with that landlord. It's still a private home, but then I say, you know what? I do need some supports. So I'm going to work with my team to bring in some people to support me. The team says, you know what? One of the ways that we can help make sure that this landlord is keeping the house, in good repair, ensuring that the home is managed in a safe manner, and that it's a safe place for me to live, is we can work with the provider to get the setting licensed, and then that way it gives us a little bit of leeway with that landlord, so that if we get a citation because we go in and there's an issue with broken railings, I can take that to the landlord and say, hey, we're not going to be able to continue to serve this person in this home unless we can get these things repaired. So there are some situations in which a provider agency who has the ability to license a setting may choose to license a private home setting. And again, in my experience, a lot of that has been to have some leverage in working with the landlord just to make sure that that setting continues to meet the residential requirements that are in the licensed facility rules. Also, some people live at home with a family member who acts as their provider or with an unrelated provider. And so when they are living in and sharing that home with the provider, then that is called shared living. And shared living settings are one setting in which there is no requirement for it to be licensed. Again, like a private home, there are some options that some providers look into, and they do choose to make a shared living home a licensed residential facility, but there is no requirement. As long as the provider of service lives in the home with the individual, then they do not have to license that home. But we have a lot of provider agencies that hire direct support professionals who then provide shared living. There's no relationship between the person, and they choose to live in the DSP's home. It still meets the definition of shared living, but the agency that employs that DSP may decide that for some reason, again, maybe to help facilitate with the DSP the importance of keeping their home in a certain at a certain level of condition. They do that agency may choose to license that shared living site. We did talk about congregate living or group homes. So again, those are really generic terms, just meaning when a group of people live together in a shared physical structure. And then we have licensed residential facilities in Ohio. And there are two different types of licensed residential facilities, and generally they're based upon the funding source. So we have licensed residential facilities that we use kind of a generic term of this is a waiver facility. And really all that means is that most of the people living in that home are receiving their services that are funded through their home and community based waiver. There can be folks living in the home who aren't on a waiver, and they may be private paying the provider for their services. But a waiver home generally is services that are provided through the home and community based waiver that are not being provided through the federal ICF program. So the second type of facility is an ICF, an intermediate care facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities. And because we are a system of also acronyms, you will often hear that referred to as an ICF for short, or an ICF IID as the full official acronym. The real difference between the waiver funded facilities and the ICF is how that funding is paid to the provider. So, in a waiver facility, just like providing homemaker personal care or other waiver services outside of a licensed residential facility, the provider will document services, they will submit billing, and then they will be reimbursed based upon the number of units, miles, or whatever that they provided. In an intermediate care facility, services are all bundled. So that provider is not just providing homemaker personal care. They are providing a package of services to the person that includes personal care, that includes food and meals, that includes housekeeping, and it includes therapies. It includes a medical component that is not automatic through the waiver. So they have doctors, nurses that are either on site or that they have access to. It's really more similar to a nursing home or other type of setting that we might be more familiar with, where you go in and you really get everything. Your meals are provided, your transportation is provided, your therapies, your health care is all provided. And unlike home and community based waiver, where you bill for the service and then you're reimbursed, the intermediate care facility is paid through a cost reporting system where they aggregate all the cost of serving all the people in that home. There's a detailed calculation that's used that creates a daily rate for that home, and then that provider is retroactively paid a daily rate for that facility, for the facility as a whole. It's not individualized like waiver folks are. Um, got a quick question in chat here, so let's take a look. Correct. So there's no, so the comment is, so group home has no legal practical meaning. It's just a term. A group home would be a licensed residential facility, one of the two types. So there is no, again, legal or practical term for group home. It is nowhere in the DODD rules. But it is not just a generic term for a licensed residential facility. So you will often hear a provider agency that have four individuals that live together in a home that they are renting off of a third party that's not the provider. And the agency may still say, "Hey, we are the provider because all four people at this home chose us as the provider, and so we operate this group home." So you may still hear it used generically even for unlicensed settings. I hope that is a good clarification. Okay. Let's see, really quick here. Make sure that so just a couple other things about the difference between the waiver and the ICF. We talked about the in a waiver funded facility, most of the folks are being funded through a home and community based waiver program. Also are able in a waiver funded facility to maintain their earned and unearned income. And so while they use their earned and unearned income to pay the rent, to pay utilities, maybe if four people live there, the rent is divided four ways and everybody contributes a fourth towards the rent. The person is still maintaining that. They may have assistance from someone to help them write the check for their rent or pay their utilities, but it goes directly to them and it's managed either through their payee, by them individually, or by the supports provided by the provider. In an ICF, the person's earned and unearned income goes directly towards their cost of care in the ICF. And then they receive a small monthly stipend that they can use for personal needs and personal items. So that's another difference between a waiver funded facility and an ICF. And then we talked a little bit about how in the ICF, the services are all bundled. So if I want to or need to go see a physical therapist and I live in an ICF, then I'm generally going to receive that service from the physical therapist who's contracted with the ICF. I have less um, choice in who I receive those ancillary type services from. In a waiver facility, I am utilizing my Medicaid card because it's not the provider who provides that service as part of a bundled package. And I'm using my Medicaid card to go out into the community with whatever supports I need to pick a physical therapist who takes my Medicaid, who has an opening, who I can get in with, and who is willing and able to see me. So those healthcare services in a waiver facility are accessed through community access, just like you and I use our insurance to access, whatever doctor or therapist takes our insurance. That's exactly how people that live in a licensed waiver facility receive their ancillary services. So those are two other distinctions between a waiver funded facility and a ICF. Okay, next
Hey,
one. Yeah.
Anne, do you mind to check? I think we might have a couple people waiting in the waiting room.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's
Let's see.
okay.
There we go. All right, welcome, folks. Sorry about the long wait in the waiting room. I apologize. I didn't realize as I was presenting that I was also managing the waiting room. So, Haida, thank you for letting me know folks were in there. So we've just talked about the types of residential settings. We really are just kind of getting into the real details here. And you will get a copy of this with all the notes. So the notes delineate the definitions of these different residential settings. You can also rewatch this on YouTube starting next week if you want to catch the little bit that you missed. So my apologies for that. All right, next one. So the other thing that is a little bit different, and we'll go through these really quick with the difference between a waiver funded licensed residential facility and an ICF, is that traditionally waiver funded facilities are settings that really blend into the community. Oftentimes you can live in a community and not even know that one of the settings is licensed, or one of the homes is licensed in your neighborhood. So these are just some generic pictures of what it might look like. There are certain rules that also apply that limit the ability to really put out any signage or anything that really points out to the community that this is a licensed residential facility and is somehow different than the other homes in the community. Next one. And again, you'll often see differences in what the interior looks like, how they're decorated, what types of required equipment, especially in the kitchens, may be in them. You will many times see a variation in the amount of individualism in them. So you might see, spaces that are more individualized. You may see more individual bedrooms versus shared bedrooms. I will say with a caveat that ICFs in the last 10 years have really, really, really move towards a very similar aesthetic in their settings. We still have what we call some legacy facilities, those facilities that have been around for years and years and years and years. We even have some ICFs in Ohio that have over 100 people living in them. And so they're more the traditional institutional based model, which we'll look at a few pictures of in a minute. But in the last 10 years, there's been some change in the department rules that have really kind of pushed the envelope in making sure that newly developed facilities, whether they're waiver based or waiver funded or ICF funded, are more community integrated, both in the number of people that live there, the actual architectural and design of the building itself, and also the interior. But there still is, for the ICF, some federal rules and laws that apply that just require some things that are somewhat institutional in nature, no matter what. And if we go to the next pictures, I'll explain what some of those are. So again, though these are beautiful, beautiful homes, you can immediately look at them and see some things that may indicate that this isn't a typical single family home. This isn't a home in which maybe just 4 people live. And so you see things like the parking area with parking signs, maybe bigger double entry doors. You may see, we are seeing more ICFs in Ohio that are popping up that are it's maybe an 8-bed ICF, but there are 4 people living on one side, 4 people living on the other side, but they have a shared passageway between them. So it looks like maybe two smaller facility or two smaller homes. But when you go inside, it really is being operated as one larger 8-bed home. So aesthetically, that gives the community kind of the vision of it being more of a single family, more of a home that would be common to their neighborhood, while the inside is being operated and managed under the ICF rules and regulations. Next one. And this is where we may see a little bit of difference. One of the big differences, especially in the kitchen, there are a lot more physical environment rules around the ICF program than there are the waiver program. So, in a facility that is licensed under the ICF program, you may see more commercial type of kitchen equipment. They're required to have larger fire suppression hoods over their ovens and stoves and grills. So you may see something that looks a little bit more like a commercial or institutional kitchen. We do see a lot more shared bedroom space in ICFs than in waiver homes, though again, I will say that I think agencies are understanding that We have families who are and individuals who, when they're exploring their residential options, they have expectations that are different than they were 25, 30 years ago. So people are expecting to have a single bedroom, maybe their own private bathroom. But again, we don't always see that in an ICF. And then sometimes in like shared common areas, like this living room and dining room area, you don't see as much individualization, independent design and decorating in that living area that you see in the smaller homes. But this is somewhat stereotypical. So I will say that this is not consistent across the board with all ICFs, but it does give you an idea of a little bit of how they do differ. Okay. All right. Another term that gets used a lot, especially when we're talking about, okay, I have a setting that I need to license, and you're beginning to explore that process. You will hear thrown around the term beds versus license. And I will never forget when I first came to the department as a licensure manager many, many years ago. I actually had someone call me and said, "Hey, I want to open a group home." We went through the discussion about does that setting have to be licensed or not. We determined that it did. We talked about what is a licensed residential facility, what does that mean? And then my first question to them was, "Well, do you already have beds?" And they said, "No, I haven't gone to the furniture store and bought beds yet." And I didn't do a good job of conveying what I meant. And what I really meant is, do you already have a license that has the capacity to serve four people? And they did not. They also didn't have beds from a furniture store yet either. But you will often hear that, do you have beds? Or do you have licensed beds? And so what I want to make sure that you understand is that a facility, if it is going to get licensed, is going to receive one certificate, which is your license. And on that certificate, it is going to tell you what the occupancy of that facility is. A facility that is waiver funded cannot have an occupancy greater than four. And that's really driven by federal rules and regulations around what is defined as an institution. And since a waiver is a program that is in lieu of institutional care, then the feds want to make sure that whatever setting waiver services are being provided in, they are being provided in a way that isn't institutional in nature. And so they go back to that capacity number. And so that magic number is four. So that's why in Ohio, licensed waiver homes cannot be created with an occupancy greater of four. You may hear about or know about licensed facilities that are waiver funded who that have more than four. And again, those are what we call legacy homes. One thing that has always existed in the licensure rules and does still exist in the licensure rule is a statement that says a licensed facility may continue to operate at the capacity for which it was licensed on the effective date of this rule. And that is just a lot of jargon for saying you're grandfathered. If you were licensed for eight when this rule went into effect, you can continue to be licensed for eight until you make a change. But the minute you make a change and you go from eight to seven or eight to six or eight to four, you can never go back up to eight. So those beds really are, when people say licensed beds, it's really a question about what is the capacity of your facility. And if you do have a facility that's licensed for four, and for some reason you decide, hey, it would be better if two of the roommates live together in a different location and the other two roommates live together in a different location. So I'm going to take that license and I'm going to split the beds into two separate licenses and make it two beds at at address one and two beds at address two. You can absolutely do that. You can also absolutely move those four all back together again because you're never going over four. So I hope that makes sense. With ICFs, it's a little bit different. Same concept that you have a license that has a capacity of the maximum number of beds, but that maximum number of beds in Ohio can now not be above eight. It's actually six, but there is a process by which a provider can submit a request to the department with financial justification to request that that be up to a maximum of eight. So the license capacity maximum for an ICF is eight. For a waiver, it is four. Questions about that, because that is often an interesting and kind of difficult concept to understand. So you have to have at least one bed to be licensed. So a licensed facility can have a capacity of one. In an ICF, you have to have a minimum of four. So an ICF can have 4 to 8. A waiver home can have 1 to 4. And as long as you stay between that 1 to 4 or that 4 to 8, you can manipulate those beds any way you want to by dividing them out. So you could take an 8 bed ICF and create a 4 bed and a 4 bed. You couldn't take an 8 bed ICF and create a 6 and a 2 because you have to have at least four people for an ICF.
And I'll
If
just kind of interject here with,
Yep.
I'm going to use one of your examples that you gave me several years ago, to kind of talk about that grandfathered licensed, right? So if we have a licensed home that has those 8 to 10 beds that was grandfathered in, so if you're in that situation where you do have that grandfathered higher capacity, the kind of thinking through that change or how that would change, let's say that structure of that home you need to rebuild it, right? Like we've got to rebuild the home because of structure issues. And so I'm gonna say what you said to me, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong. But basically, when we would say, okay, we're ready to rebuild, we still have that number of beds, but we would have to build it into the new rule of capacity. So those homes wouldn't be able to have more than 4 individuals in them. So 4 beds, for instance, could go with one home, right? We can do that math of kind of moving and manipulating that. But that's kind of the example I draw on frequently when I think about those grandfathered situations, that as soon as we have to change it, there's some kind of change that's coming about, that we then need to fall in line with the current rule regarding capacity.
So, Heidi, you're absolutely right for waiver funded facilities. And I don't, unless somebody wants to specifically call me or reach out to me later, there is some caveats that are a little bit different for ICFs because the ICF program has something called replacement homes, which DODDs and the state system does not have that. So ICFs are a federal funding program, so there are federal rules that apply. So there is this concept of a replacement home for ICF. So if anybody on here is interested in more conversation about ICF development or licensing, feel free to give me a call or I'm going to share some names at the department and some contact information and you can have that conversation. But it is just a little bit different for ICFs, but you're absolutely right. For a waiver home, if there's 8 beds there and it's historically been 8 beds, it really doesn't matter what the reason is that there needs to be a change. If it's going to change, it has to meet the new capacity limits. So, yeah. A couple other things with this. I'm sorry, not quite ready yet. Sorry. Um, Folks will often come to me and again, or I'm sorry, I'm so used to being the person they come to. They don't do that anymore. People will often come to the department, and they will say things like, "Hey, I want to open a licensed residential facility," or "Hey, here's my situation," and I will say to them, "That situation has to be licensed." And their next question is, well, how do I do that? And my first question to them is, do you have licensed beds? And they say no. and they say, how do I get them? And so we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I want you to understand that in 2002, the Ohio legislature passed a law to cap the number of licensed beds in Ohio. So there is a total capacity. So when you add all the licensed beds that are assigned to each license, when you add all those up together, that gives you the statewide capacity. And the minute that a provider says, I don't want this licensed bed anymore, or I don't need it anymore, and I'm going to just relinquish it and voluntarily give it back to the state of Ohio, then that statewide cap goes down by that one licensed bed. And so you'll often hear people say, well, there's no new licenses in Ohio, so you can't open a licensed residential facility anyway. And that's not completely true. Ohio is not issuing any new licenses for any capacity. So Ohio has no new licensed beds that they're giving out. But we can continue to operate within that total statewide cap. So there are some providers who have licensed beds that are inactive. They are currently not assigned to a licensed residential facility. They're not on the bed count on any license, but the state of Ohio still has them. They're still assigned to that particular provider, and that particular provider said, even though I don't want them right now, I don't need them right now, I am not voluntarily relinquishing them. So I want to keep them on hold until I need them in the future. Those are the beds that we're really talking about when we talk about developing a brand new licensed facility. So, as an agency, if you don't already have those, but you're like, wow, we have a situation where we'd like to have a license for that setting, you have to be able to um, find those existing beds within the system and obtain ownership of them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. But there are ways that you can go about doing that. And I really suggest that you first contact your local county board. Say, hey, are you aware of any providers in your county that maybe have unused licensed beds, or who've, a lot of times they're privately owned, and maybe someone is getting older, and the county board says, yeah, I think Ann Weisson's been thinking about retiring, and she used to have a licensed residential facility. Don't know what she did with her beds, but maybe you could contact her. So you're going to get a lot of that local knowledge by contacting the county board. You can also utilize the DODD provider search tool. So if you go onto the DODD website and you go under supporting families, you'll find the provider search tool in that area of the website. And you're able to go in there and search by licensed facility. And then you can delineate waiver licensed facility or ICF. And when you do that, that's going to give you a list of every licensed facility. You can get the whole list for Ohio. You can search by county. So you can drill down as far as you want to. But what that's going to do is it's going to tell you that group home A, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't use that, facility A in Cuyahoga County has a license for 5 people, and they currently have 4 people living in there. So that's going to tell you, hey, they're grandfathered for that 5th bed. They don't have anybody in it right now. Wonder what they're going to do with it. Maybe I could call them and say, I'm interested if you're interested in transferring ownership. So those are a couple of ways. And then in Ohio, we have some provider associations. We have Opera. We have OCA, we have Ohio Waiver Network, and then we have the Faith and Values Alliance. And all of them are providers who've come together and are supported by these associations. So again, kind of like your county boards, these associations may know of a provider who is doing some changes and might have beds available. There's no guarantee, but again, that's another place that I have directed people in the past uh, to uh, to look for them. Sorry, we have a question here. Wanted to ask if there are any organizations that assist with the process of getting licenses as a residential facility. Yes, I believe that is something that 19 Services can actually do. My job here is provider support. So if you are interested and you need that support, we can work with our director, Christy Black, and figure out what a consulting situation would look like. But I think we can absolutely support a provider who is wanting some guidance on the process. So feel free to reach out. All right, awesome. Go ahead. Let's go to the next one. There are a number of rules that apply. And one of the first things that you need to do when you're thinking about opening a licensed facility is go to the rules. So we've talked about some of that stuff. We've talked about what the maximum bed count is. There are rules around physical environment and what the actual building has to include, look like, what the safety features have to be, square footage requirements. There's also language in the rules that address the proximity of licensed facilities. Licensed facilities, you can't have more than one on the same piece of property. You can't have licensed facilities on adjacent properties, and you can't have licensed facilities in a um, space that gives the impression of isolation. So even if you had three, let's say you have six pieces of property, and you say property one is going to be a facility, property two is going to be a separate space, but it's going to be open and we're never going to build on it. Property three is going to be another facility, property four is going to be an empty space, and then property five. Now you have three group homes, three facilities on a cul-de-sac separated by these two or three vacant spaces. Yes, it meets the intent of the rule. You only have one facility on each property and they're not adjacent because you created a vacant space in between them. But when you look at that cul-de-sac, now you have the disability cul-de-sac. It really has created a community that is isolating. And so the federal rules that apply about the Medicaid funding that you're getting for a waiver setting disallows this image of isolation. And so the state has to take that into consideration when they're looking at what your proposal is. So again, kind of keep those things in mind. And that type of information can be found in the department's suitability of settings rule, as well as in the federal rule. And a little bit later in the presentation, we'll talk about some of that in detail. You also have to look into what your local rules are. What are the ordinances? How many people can live together in a single family home? What parts of your community are zoned appropriately for an ICF or a waiver home. So you have to look into those. You also, because you are a business, a licensed facility is a business, you have to meet the requirements of the Ohio Fire Code. And then for ICFs, there's that extra layer of federal rules. Anything that's in here in gold, or I guess it's gold print, that is a link. So it is an active link that will take you to those. Okay. So let's go to the next one. When do you actually need a license? So we've talked about capacity. So you would have to be licensed if there are more than four unrelated people with a developmental disability living in a home. Well, you can't create anything new with more than four. So this really only applies to those existing licensed residential facilities. So they have to keep that license. They can't get rid of it and still have more than four people. So that's not going to apply if you're wanting to open a group home because that only applies to existing settings. So the biggest issue about when you absolutely have to have a license is when the owner of the home and the provider of the services are the same entity or person. And so we're going to talk a little bit in detail about what that looks like or where you get some guidance on that. So let's go to the next one. Oh, we have a question. So let me get to the question here real quick and then we'll go to the next slide. There's a question about the process. So Isaiah, thank you for your question. We're going to get to the process in the slides. All right, go ahead to the next slide, please. So, um, the Federal Registry, which is what CFR stands for, that is how the federal government codes federal law. And so that is a link at the top that takes you to 42 CRF 441.530. And this is the federal law that governs home and community based settings. So anywhere in which home and community based waiver funding is being used to pay for the services, those settings, whether they're residential or whether they are vocational in nature, have to meet the settings requirements outlined in this federal law. And so we'll just go through them really quick. This was effective in 2014. States had, I think, 10 years to actually implement a whole process around this. Ohio's rules became effective in 2023 that governed how Ohio was going to come in compliance with this. So first of all, community integration. Settings must support full access to the community. This again applies to whether it's a vocational setting, where employment services are going on, whether it is a adult day setting where more socially based day services are going on, or whether it is home and community based. I'm sorry, homemaker personal care. Individual has to have a choice of their settings. So they've got to be able to decide where do they want to receive their home and community-based waiver services. The caveat to that is that when a person chooses to live in a licensed residential facility, they are also choosing the provider in that setting as their provider. So if you live in an unlicensed setting, you can choose any provider you want to come into your setting. And if you have a roommate who's also receiving home and community based services, they can choose whoever they want. So you can have an unlicensed residential setting that has multiple providers coming in and providing the services. In a licensed setting, by virtue of being licensed, the individual who then has choice of that setting is choosing that provider as the provider of services. So all four people that would live in that licensed setting are choosing the same provider. They have rights and protections. So the setting has to ensure privacy. It has to ensure their dignity. It has to ensure with the respect for the person and that they're free from coercion or restraint. And that's going to be a really important part of our discussion about the prohibition of a provider also being the landlord unless they license the facility. Because as you all know, when you live with a private landlord, that landlord can decide generally to go through the eviction process and kick you out. In a licensed setting, they have to have a similar process to eviction that protects your rights. And I can't, as the provider, put on my landlord hat and evict you because you had a really bad day yesterday and you punched a hole in the wall of the house that I own. So being licensed gives the person some protections that are guaranteed under this federal law. Next screen. The setting has to ensure autonomy and independence. So folks need to have control over their daily activities, their interactions, and their physical environment. They can decorate the rooms the way that they want to. They can, as a group, sit down and look at the schedule of events going on in their community and decide where they want to go and who wants to go and do we all want to go together. It has to give choice of service and providers. Again, being licensed is what allows the licensed setting to limit that choice to just the provider who holds the license for that setting. In any unlicensed setting, again, the individual has the choice to bring in whoever they want for their services and their providers. In a licensed setting, they still have that right. They can choose any provider they want, but if they choose a different provider, then they can't maintain living in the licensed facility. And then the rule also requires legally enforceable agreements, which in all settings, you have to have a lease agreement or a residency agreement with the person that lives in that setting. Next one. Privacy and personalization, we've talked about that. Control over schedule and access, having access to food in the home really at any time. We certainly know some people that may have things written into their plan that put some limitations on that, but unless that is truly an approved intervention that's in the plan, folks need to have access to that to any time, be able to have visitors, be able to make phone calls and talk to whoever they want, be able to have guests over. And this applies in all settings. So again, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, if I want to invite someone over to my licensed setting that I live in, I have the right to do that. Now I may need to talk with my roommates about, hey, can I bring them over at 3 o'clock in the morning? And we may have to all make a decision that 3 o'clock in the morning is not the right time to have guests, because my other three roommates are sleeping, and figure it out. Excuse me, and work through those things. But I do have a right to have that conversation. And then I have to be, my setting has to be accessible. So those are the tenets of the federal law. And those again apply in licensed and unlicensed settings, but choice of provider does look a little bit different in licensed and unlicensed settings. All right, next one. The other thing that rule specifically calls out is around those lease agreements. And so Ohio has incorporated into Ohio Administrative Code through the suitability of services and settings rule what that looks like. And they've identified two different types of residential settings. There is a provider controlled setting. So that means in some way, the provider has the authority to make some decisions over that setting, or they're in a relationship with someone who has that authority. So this is exactly how it's defined in rule. A provider controlled residential setting is an entity that is owned in whole or part by the individual's independent provider. So I'm an independent provider, but I own a realty company, and my realty company is the company that owns the house. Um, an immediate family member of the individual's immediate provider. So I'm the independent provider. My husband has a company that owns rental properties, and the person wants to live in that setting. An immediate family member of an owner or a management employee of the individual agency provider. So if I'm an agency and my owner, the agency owner, um, owns the home, then it meets the definition of provider controlled. If I'm an agency provider and my HR director owns the home, it is considered provider controlled. If I'm an agency provider and my director of nursing sister owns the home, it is provider controlled. So it's based on those relationships. If the home or residential setting is affiliated with the individual's agency provider, meaning the landlord employs a person who's also the owner or management employee of the agency, or someone serves on the board and that board member is affiliated with the landlord. A provider controlled residential setting is also an entity. It means an entity that is owned in whole or part by an owner, management employee, or an immediate family member of the individual's agency, or an owner or management employee of the individual's agency provider. So all of these just mean that there is a relationship that is of such a nature that there is some perceived authority over the actual residence itself, the actual home itself. And those are considered provider controlled. A provider controlled setting has to have a lease or residency agreement between the landlord and the person or people that are living in the home. A provider controlled setting does not have to be licensed. It has to have that lease or residency agreement. Next one. The second type is a provider owned residential setting. And so we talked about earlier how one of the reasons that you would have to be licensed is when the entity that is providing the services is also acting as or is the landlord or the owner of the property. So a provider owned residential setting means a setting in which a single person or entity owns the property and will be the provider. So agency ABC has been selected as the provider of services. And when you go to the auditor's website and you look at the address where the services will be provided, the residential services will be provided, and agency ABC is the owner of record of that, then that is a provider owned residential setting. Even if that, even if the provider agency is called ABC Provider Company, and the owner of the home is called ABC Real Estate, if they share the same tax ID number but a different name, it is a provider owned residential setting. It is a provider owned residential setting when the property owner is subleasing to the provider and the provider is acting in capacity as landlord on behalf of the actual landlord. So there's a totally different owner of the home that's not the same as the provider, but the owner of the home has subleased to that provider, therefore putting the provider in a position to act as landlord. Okay. And then there's just a caveat of the providers acting as the role of landlord via an agreement or arrangement, which just was to capture something maybe different than a formal sublease. But it's the same idea that there's some agreement between the actual property owner and the provider where the provider is acting or fulfilling the role of landlord. So those are provider owned, and a provider owned setting must be licensed. Okay. The link at the bottom is a page on DODD's website that really spells out and provides guidance around those definitions and what that looks like. And then the link at the top, obviously, is the rule. Next slide. So, since we said that a provider owned setting includes a setting in which there is a sublease, this is what the governance is around subleasing. So Ohio law has a prohibition because a single entity can control both the residents and also provide the services. And so the only way to be able to do anything like that is it absolutely has to be a licensed setting. So again, the link at the bottom is the subleasing guidance from the department. All right, so let's go to the actual process. All of this has been building up to, do I need a license or don't I need a license? And if after all of this conversation, you're like, well, I'm a provider agency, I also own the home. Yep, I got to be licensed. Or I'm a provider agency. Nope, I don't own the home, but there is some situation in which it seems to make sense that we would use one of our licensed beds to license this home so that we have maybe a little bit of control over making sure the home is maintained in certain condition. And then honestly, I will tell you this, and this is just from someone who's been in the field for over 30 years. A long, long time ago, before we had provider compliance at the department, the only settings that were reviewed by the state were licensed residential facilities. The state years ago did not go out and do provider reviews. They didn't do independent provider reviews. They didn't do agency reviews when you were providing services outside of a licensed residential facility. But that goes back 30 plus years. But even given the fact that that's not been the way we've operated in Ohio for 25 plus years, there is still, for some people, this assumption that if you are or the setting is somehow licensed, that you are somehow getting a higher level of scrutiny by the state of Ohio, and therefore it's an indicator of quality or better services. That is completely false because as a certified provider, doesn't matter where you're providing services, doesn't matter if it's a licensed setting or an unlicensed setting, you're still going through a review. There are certainly a few things that are looked at differently in a licensed facility because that licensed setting has that extra group of licensure rules. So physical environment is being looked at differently in a licensed setting than it is in an unlicensed setting. But again, generally, other than that, the review is consistent across the board. And so I have worked with some providers in the past who have said, we want to license this setting just because we think it will make the family, the community, other people feel more confident. We've had some communities that have been less than welcoming to people with disabilities living in their community. And providers have decided that if I license this setting, I can go and talk with community members and the local city council or zoning or whoever it is and say, hey, look, here's these licensure rules that apply. There's this extra scrutiny. There's, we're being held to this standard. And it's been somewhat of a positive promise to communities that are hesitant. So there can be a million reasons why an agency may decide I'm just going to license it. So whatever that reason is, whether you're required to be licensed by rule or whether you choose to license a setting for some other reason, we're going to talk about what that process looks like. Okay. All right. So the very first thing I'm going to start off by saying is please do not invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into a physical structure until you've had some conversation. If your intent is to use that physical structure as a congregate living, a group home setting for people with disabilities, please make sure that you are starting with your county board, having some conversation there, maybe reaching out also to the department to have some conversation there before you even invest a penny. I have seen situations where hundreds of thousands of dollars have been invested into a building that never ends up meeting the requirements of the rule and therefore cannot be used for the purpose for which they initially bought the building. So please start these conversations early. If you are an existing landlord or your agency is and you want to change the use of your buildings from whatever you're using it for now to residential rentals for people with disabilities, have that conversation. If you are thinking about building something new, have that conversation. New construction is finicky. There's a lot of developers out there who will say to you, we absolutely have expertise in building residential facilities for people with disabilities, and they don't know the difference between a mental health facility, a DODD facility, a Department of Aging facility, and the rules and requirements are very different. So, caveat, start all that conversation first. But once you're ready to go, if you already own existing beds, you're good to go. If you don't already own existing licensed bed slots, then you need to obtain them from somewhere. And we talked about some ways that you might find them. Once you find them, you have to first submit a change of ownership application. So you have to work with the current owner of those beds or that license with 4 beds, and you have to go to the department and request that the ownership gets transferred from the current owner to you. Once that happens, and sometimes these things can happen simultaneously depending upon what the timelines are, but again, another reason to engage with someone at the department about how to make the timing work. But once you have the ownership of those homes, you can then start that process of actually developing the new licensed residential facility. Review the rules. So again, as soon as you get those beds, all right, I need to review the rules, make sure I understand how I can use these, how I can't use these. Meet with DODD if necessary. Again, I highly recommend that for any new construction. And then I recommend that for any other type of setting that you want to get licensed, you start that conversation with your county board and then potentially also reach out. You can email licensure development apps at dodd.ohio.gov to get connected directly with the person at DODD who is responsible for facility licensing, and you can ask to meet with them. And you can ask questions via email. You can set up an online virtual chat with them, and they generally are very, very helpful. So once you've done that, you're ready to move forward. You're going to submit that new facility application, which is available through PSM. So it's the same place you go to submit your certification application or your certification renewal. It's just a different type of application that's in PSM. And that needs to be done at least 60 days prior to the date you want to open that new facility. All right, and go to the next one. There are fees. This is another reason why it's really important to have those conversations before you get started, so that if you submit that application and you pay the fee, which is non-refundable, you know that you are on the best trajectory to get your facility approved. Please don't submit that application and not know that, because you're going to lose out on this. They're not huge fees, but every penny adds up. Facilities with that you want to open between 1 and 15 beds, so all waiver facilities are going to have $100 licensure fee. Facilities with 16 or more beds, which again really doesn't exist unless it's the renewal of their license, it's a $500 licensure fee. So pretty much everybody is at that $100 when it is a new development. Okay, next one. All right, so you have talked to the department, you've read over the rules, you've gotten your beds, you've filled out that initial application. You need to know what your proposed opening date is going to be. And that's really going to be dependent upon a lot of factors. If you don't currently have someone slated like, you're already like, hey, I've been talking to the county board, this person needs a place, they've selected me as a provider. If you don't have that, you're pretty open to any opening date. If you are working with a county to really provide housing for someone who's in need, and that person has selected you as a provider, then you're going to work with that team to say, hey, what kind of situation is the person in? Is this urgent? Do we need to do it quick? And that's how you're going to decide what your opening date is. You're going to need to, as part of that application process, provide the name, address, and contact information for the city, village, or township clerk. So make sure that you know how to get that and where that is. There is a requirement in Ohio, and that's one of the reasons why the application has to be in 60 days in advance, that the local governing authority has 30 days. So the department is going to send a notice to them once you give them the name and address that there is a new licensed residential facility being developed, and then they are able to give feedback back to the department. They can't stop it as long as it's legal, as long as you're in the right area, and zoned correctly and all that kind of stuff. They can't stop it, but believe me, there are many municipalities that will come back and address concerns. But again, I think the department does a good job of explaining to them what they can say no to and what they can't say no to. So just know that that's part of why there's a 60-day window. You also need to, through this process, identify who your facility administrator is going to be. So every licensed facility, waiver, and ICF has to have an identified facility administrator, the person who is responsible for operations of that particular licensed facility. It can be if you're a small agency, it can be your DOO. I mean, that's fine. There's nothing that prohibits that. Larger agencies tend to have someone who specifically does residential supervision of residential programs. So whoever it is, identify them, and they will need to go online and complete the administrator training. That has to be completed again before this process is all finalized. You're also going to want to look at the physical environment requirements for your facility or the proposed facility, and make sure that you are meeting those. Not only is it square footage, it's also things like grab bars and handrails and how wide the doors have to be and handicap accessibility and all of those types of things. It also requires that there be an emergency response training plan that is specific to the building. So the people that live there and the DSPs who provide services, how are you going to train them on what a tornado drill looks like in that particular building? Does it have a basement? Does it only have a crawl space? If it only has a crawl space, where are they going to go? Are they going to the bathroom? Are they going to a closet? So that training plan has to cover all of that, and it has to be specific to that particular setting. And then there has to be an actual evacuation plan. Usually that's your visual plan of where people will go, where is the outdoor meeting space in case of a fire, etc. You also have to obtain the required inspections. So each facility is required to have a fire inspection by your local fire authority. If they are not on a city water system, they have to have a water inspection. If they're not on a city septic system, they have to have a septic inspection. They also have to have a HVAC inspection and an electrical inspection. All of these have to be done by a licensed contractor. So you and I know there's a guy out there that says he'll change my light bulbs for $50. He's not a licensed electrician, right? But he'll come and put a new ceiling fan up in my house. That's great. And he may advertise himself as, ABC Electrical Company. He's not going to be able to submit that inspection for you. It has to be a licensed contractor. And you can verify someone's license by going to the Ohio Department of Commerce website, and you can find all licensed inspectors on that website. Next one. So once you've submitted that application, your administrator has gotten trained, you are in the process of, I'm sorry, and you have gotten all of your inspections. They're all ready to go. The physical environment is ready for someone to move in. So that means that you have furniture in place. It means that you have window coverings. It means that you have your smoke detectors and your CO2 detectors. That building is ready for someone to move into, then you need to notify DODD you're ready for what they call the feasibility study. The feasibility study is kind of a pre-survey or a pre-review of the facility that looks at everything other than service delivery, because you haven't done service delivery yet. So they're looking at all that physical environment stuff. They're looking at all of the accessibility stuff. And so you're going to contact them and say, I'm ready. They're going to work with you to select a date for the reviewer to come out, and for someone from the compliance team to conduct that feasibility study. And then you will be notified if there are any deficiencies. Now, you can't be cited because you don't have a license yet, but you can be told that there are deficiencies in place that you have to correct before you can receive your license. Once you have corrected those deficiencies, or if there are no deficiencies in place at the time of your feasibility, your license will then be issued by DODD. If you haven't already done so, you would then begin working with the county board to find individuals who want to move into the home, and you would work with their teams on what that looks like, what their services are, and what their service plan looks like. You can expect an initial compliance review within 90 days of your license effective date. So they are going to come out sometime within that. I'm sorry, that says 90 days. I need to correct that. It's within 9 months. So I will correct this before we send this out to you. It is initial review within 9 months of your license issue date. And then you will receive your first license, which will be for 1 year. And then after that, you can get a renewed license for up to 3 years, depending upon the outcome of your licensure review. There are some situations in which you don't have a good licensure review and you go into sanctions, which can vary from, giving you some time to correct the citations without taking on new business, called a suspension, or possibly a revocation. If you do go into a sanction, you would only get a 1 year license if that sanction is lifted. But if you have a good outcome on your review, then you can potentially get up to a 3 year license. This is current. I do expect that over the next year or so, as the department is figuring out how they're addressing the fraud, abuse, and waste issues, there could be some change to the structure of licensing. But right now, this is what is currently in rule. Again, down here at the bottom, this is a link. It's a link to the DODD website and their licensure guidance. So you can find more information there. That was a huge and quick run through of the process. I hope that whoever asked that about the process, I hope I answered the questions that you had. Again, if you have more detailed questions, feel free to reach out to us. But we're going to go on to the last few slides here. This would then result in you getting a license, and it's time to provide services. So one of the biggest questions I get from people is, well, how do I get paid? It's no different really than how you get paid when you're billing home and community-based waiver services in an unlicensed setting. The people that live in your home are going to be on a waiver. If they're not on a waiver and they're private pay, then as an agency, you'll have to make arrangements with them and their family and guardians and whatever that private pay arrangement looks like. But for people that are on a waiver, you are going to provide the services in that licensed facility or in the community based on what's in the service plan. You're going to stay within the authorized units that are in the pause, and you are going to be reimbursed for those services. The only other thing that is different is that in a licensed facility, if the provider is also the landlord, then you are also potentially going to be receiving the rent, utilities, and other necessities, and they call that room and board. And there is a whole rule called the room and board rule that you can look at to see how room and board is determined for a person, how you would go about billing them for room and board. If you are not the landlord and it's a licensed setting and they're still paying rent to a landlord, then you are probably going to be receiving some HPC to maybe help them with paying their bills, managing their money, where your role would be helping them make that payment to their landlord, make that payment to their utility companies. But if you, as the agency, are the actual owner of the home, you're the one that's being paid rent, you're the one that's paying the utilities, then that individual is going to pay you through what's called room and board, which comes from their earned and unearned income. Any money they're making from a job or any money that's coming in through uh, their benefits. Additionally, there is something called supported living. And so that was one of our terms, and I want to make sure that I address what that term is. Supported living is a funding source that is local. So that is the local county board utilizing county board dollars to pay for services. In some cases, you may have someone who isn't on a waiver. Maybe they're on a waiver waiting list, but they had a primary caregiver pass away, so they don't have a waiver for you to get paid through the waiver. And the county board says we'd like them to move into your licensed facility, and the county board is going to pay for that until they get enrolled on a waiver. That would be supported living funding. And the other thing about supported living, just so that if you don't know, it's something to know, is that supported living dollars are county dollars that are used to access the federal dollars that pay for home and community-based waiver. So home and community-based waiver, when you're getting paid for HPC, 40% of that comes from a local funding and 60% of it comes from the federal government. And in order to access that 60% that comes from the federal government, the local entity, the county board, has to pay the first 40%. So supported living also is a part of HCBS waiver funding. So next one. All right, and we did talk about this a little bit, that there are lots of rules and laws that apply, and you want to be familiar with them before you start that process. So make sure that you're reaching out to your local officials about what local zoning laws look like. Here are links to all of those other rules that are applicable to being licensed. Next one. Here are the email addresses for folks at DODD. So if you have questions about feasibility or how, what are the licensure rules, you can contact the compliance mailbox. If you want to talk about the actual process of submitting an application, you can email the licensure mailbox. And then the department has a provider support team that is very willing to talk through some of the things we've talked through today. And you can reach them at that email address. And that's it. This was a lot of information in a very, very short time. So I apologize for that. If you have any other questions, I'm not seeing any in chat. I think we've answered all the things that are in chat. Please feel free. You can email Haida or myself, and these are our email addresses. And again, oh, look at that last slide. June 18th. No, it will not be June 18th. It will be September. Try to look at my calendar really quick. Third Thursday in September, which will be September 17th. So that will be our next session. And please watch for an email that will be coming as a follow-up to today's meeting. It'll have a link. It'll also have the topic for the next session. And we will get that out to you early next week. Thank you all for joining us today. It's always great to see you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.